Welcome and good evening. Tonight we're going to continue our learning of the halachas of the Rambam. As we described last time, the Rambam sets forth in great clarity the mitzvahs of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. And what I want to accomplish now is to go through these. We did the first three last time, and you could watch the video of that. But what I want to accomplish now is to go through the remaining four mitzvahs of the seven. There's a couple of key points we have to mention over here. That these seven mitzvahs that we're discussing are the seven mitzvahs that are obligated on the Bnei Noach, that carry with them the most severest of consequences, which is the death penalty. This is not saying that there's no other mitzvahs that they're obligated in, as we're going to see later on in the Rambam and other halachic sforim that we're going to cover. In addition, we have to realize that there are many, many mitzvahs that are branches of a bezvayu of different of these mitzvahs that we have to make sure that we understand. Many of those are covered also and obligated on a non-Jewish human being who is alive. Basically, the whole existence of a human being is meant to be in service of his creator and her creator, and that is their function, their purpose. All of us are meant to recognize our creator and be in service of that creator, as we've discussed earlier. So keep in mind that the span of the relationship between God and humanity is much broader than the seven commandments, but the seven commandments are an anchor point and a firm grounding of the relationship between a human being and his or her creator. Now, I also want to address the fact that when we're learning the Rambam here, we're learning it on the most basic level possible. And the reason we're learning it on the most basic level possible is for two reasons. Number one is I want to make it clear that the teaching of Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach is accessible to every single Jewish person. This is the job of every single Jewish person, regardless of the level of their learning, regardless of the level of their scholarship. There are many, many details in these halachas of the Rambam, which many people who will be listening to this are very, very familiar with, and they could go into great detail in the details of the halachas of the Rambam. There's many commentators on the Rambam and that will give details on the halachas, but the key in this part of what we're learning is not to go into all the details and the nuances, because I want to communicate to you that you as a Jewish person, regardless of the level of your learning and exposure, are completely competent and capable of teaching a non-Jew. And that's why I want to keep it in the simplest terms possible, and in future opportunities we'll go into much greater depth for those that have the experience and the interest in going to the greater depth. You always have first of all, the Rambam intended that in writing the Mishnah Torah, that you should be able to learn this and not need to learn any other sefer. So while we definitely value the commentaries on the Rambam, at the same time, his intention was that it wouldn't need all that commentary. So we should be able to learn the basic concepts straight from the Rambam himself. Now, obviously, once you start to teach non-Jews, you'll start to come across questions and issues that might be beyond the simplest understanding of the halachas, and that's why we have the commentaries, and that's why we have opened up the ability to ask questions, and there's many people who can answer those questions, and we're happy to do our part in providing a forum to answer those questions. But you'll be able to reach those things. You'll be able to cross that bridge when you come to it. My point is, don't get bogged down in the details in a way that's going to prevent you from teaching non-Jews. Because what happens is, a lot of people, they're used to very, very detailed learning, and they feel that the only way that they can go ahead and teach somebody is if they know all the details and answers to all the possible questions. And what that really is a great way to stop a person from teaching Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. Because they say, one second, I'm not an expert in this. No one is asking for a person to be an expert. If you're a Jew, that's your job. And if you know one thing, then you should teach that to a non-Jew. What will happen is, by the virtue of you teaching and coming up against questions and getting those answers, you will become more and more of an expert. You'll be able to answer more and more questions. But don't let what you perceive to be your lack of expertise and lack of knowledge be an impediment in any way whatsoever. When the degree to which humanity is starving for spiritual sustenance makes it so urgent to be teaching people, and our egos can't get in the way as to wondering and questioning how great an expert we are. So that's why I want to keep the learning of the Rambam right now on the level of the simplest way possible, that will give you the possibility and give you the tools and the confidence to be able to go out and explain it to somebody. So we're learning now Hilchos Malachim, Perek Tes, and we are in the halacha Hey, and the fifth halacha. And over here, the Rambam is talking about the fourth of the mitzvahs. The first was Avodah Zarah. It's forbidden for any human being to recognize any force as being independent from God. So, to briefly recap, serving an idol means believing that something besides God has power. Once a person believes that something besides God has power, they're automatically taking away from God his omnipotence. In their minds, there is another force. That's forbidden. Being anything other than grateful to God is also forbidden. And then, of course, it's forbidden to murder somebody, and that includes abortion, and includes even a person who's imminently going to die. It's also forbidden to participate in their death. That's what we covered last time. So now we start to learn the laws that relate to the conduct of intimacy and sexual morality. And here the Rambam describes that the forbidden relationships, a person's not allowed to be in an intimate relationship with his mother, the wife of his father, a woman who's married to another man is forbidden, his sister from his mother. He's not allowed to be in any physical intimacy with another man or with an animal. And these are the six basic forbidden relationships to all human beings. And he brings as a proof of this concept that this applies to all of humanity. It says that a man is meant to leave his parents, and this means that he cannot be in a relationship with his mother. He has to go and find another woman. That's not one of the forbidden relationships to him. And he has to connect with Dabek Be'ishto. He has to connect with his wife meaning not the wife of another man. So this is a fundamental cornerstone of humanity. We are not allowed to be in any form of relationship, a forbidden relationship with the wife of another man. That is something that is forbidden to all humanity. And it says he has to bind with his wife. That means not with a man, and they should become one flesh. And that means he cannot be trying to bind himself with something that he can't become one flesh with. It's impossible to be one flesh with an animal or some sort of bird. And it's impossible to become one basar, to become one flesh. And the point over here, in terms of teaching the non-Jews about these concepts, really comes down to a fundamental focus on what is a person's energy, his sexual energy, supposed to be used for. It's supposed to be used for creating, bringing life into the world. A non-Jew is also obligated to bring life into the world, and anything that's going to distract him from that, including spilling a seed, is something that is not permissible because it takes away his energy from that. And I had a Rav who once tried to argue with me on this issue about whether spilling seed is something that's forbidden to non-Jews, and he brought different proof that it's in the scope of this class to discuss. However, the answer, I believe, is still that, in fact, the proper conduct is to not do so, and the proper way to lead by example and by teaching is that this is something that's not permissible. And the fundamental reason is because once we understand that it is a distraction from our primary procreative energies, that is something that is not in God's will, because God wants all our energies to be put into the creation of new human beings. So that then leads us over here the different discussions about someone that is how the relationship with if a woman has a relationship with a father that's other than through marriage, whether that is going to be forbidden. And the answer is yes, that's also forbidden. I see that someone has a chat question over here. And the answer to the question is that it's not written. The Rambam does not bring down that hashchasa is guilty of death, but this is an example when we're talking about the concept of Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach. We're not limiting it to just what is liable for the death penalty. That's a viewpoint that all the Chachamim really saw, that this is a blueprint for life, guiding people in their entire life. Don't limit your thinking about it to just what is a death penalty or not. That is not the limitation on what you're meant to be teaching them and the example you're meant to be showing them. So that's the answer to your question. Thank you for asking that. Also over here, that the age of a relationship with a male is irrelevant, or an animal. It's something that's forbidden. And it spells out here the consequences. We know the consequences for human beings, the consequences for the animal. If the animal was to participate in such an act, it does not have to be executed in the case of a non-Jewish person. So the question that the Rambam addresses is, when does a woman be considered forbidden to be considered the wife of another human being? And that is after a man and a woman have engaged in intimacy. At that point, she becomes forbidden to another man. Now, this does not mean, so let's just back up for a second. What that means in the strictest sense of the words is if she's already engaged, then that would not technically prevent the person from being intimate with her. However, obviously, that is not the way a person is supposed to be conducting himself. So again, this is an example where the lesson and the light of morality for all of humanity is that once a woman has committed herself to another man through the process of engagement, then she should honor that commitment, and someone else should not be coming to divert her from that. So you have to distinguish between what's the proper guidance for humanity from what is a court of law going to be required to give the death penalty for. And that's really, really very important, because often we start to think about things in terms of we think of chayav, obligated, or mutter, or permissible, in terms of consequences. And we have to realize that it's a much broader definition of what's right and wrong here than merely what there is a consequence for. That's not the guidelines as to how a person should conduct themselves. Now, if you're now in a situation that someone comes and asks you a question, that they're supposed to sit on a court of law of non-Jewish court of law, and they ask you what is the law in this case, then you can answer them the specific consequences based on that. But we are talking here, and there will be situations like that. You have to be prepared to answer those questions when the time comes, either know where to look or who to ask. But when we're understanding the framework of the Rambam, we're understanding he's providing us the consequences and which things are going to fall into those very important consequences. So the Rambam then continues over here. There's a slightly different issues with and consequences if the non-Jewish person has relationships with a married Jewish woman, and we can that's outside really the scope of this class, but it's something to be aware of in terms of a court of law will be required to implement that law and those consequences. Now, in Halacha Ches talks about the situation of a person has a woman set aside for someone that's in the status of a slave, and when she's considered to be now forbidden to any other man. Now, the Rambam then continues with a very fascinating question. Okay, so now we understand this halacha. So when is she now freed from this restriction? So he asked the question. So when will the wife of his friend, literally a married woman, when will she be considered like a divorcee, for that she's now permissible to other men, that she could now remarry? And the answer is here that when he she's sent out from his house and she's sent to be her own person, she's no longer bound up with him, or she can decide to leave him and she goes on her own way. So they don't have an obligation to put this in writing, meaning to say it's not like in a Jewish divorce situation, God forbid, where there's a whole process of writing up what's essentially a written document that memorializes this and has very specific requirements. That's not necessary. What's required is that upon their decision to no longer be focused on their relationship, they're now going to go their separate ways, and then that is sufficient to now make that permissible. And this is not something that's only dependent on the man, meaning it could be a mutual decision. Each one has the authority and the power to go their own way. And he or she can both decide, or either one of them obviously, decide. And once that person's left, now they've left. And if that woman now goes into a relationship with another man, that is something that's permissible. Okay, so then the question is, well, what's the next mitzvah? The next mitzvah is stealing. And it's very interesting over here because it says that a non-Jewish person is obligated and forbidden to steal, whether he's stealing from another non-Jew or from a Jewish person. And this concept of stealing applies to both stealing money and stealing people. So kidnapping is something that is forbidden to non-Jews. It's also forbidden, similarly, a person who refuses to pay his employees. So this is something that really needs to be driven home. The concept of our responsibility, every human being, is to pay the people that have done work for them. This is not something that is negotiable, and it's not something that can be then used as an opportunity to try to get a better deal. A person has an obligation to pay his employees. That applies no matter what, and is considered gezel, according to the Rambam here, and all the consequences of that. So that's something that's really important to help educate people to that, because we discussed earlier that the fact that a person steals from another is showing a lack of their understanding and grounding in their connection to their Creator, to God Almighty, who's constantly bestowing upon us all good and everything that we need. So theft is only a thought to a person if they have a question or doubt or don't feel that God is actually providing them. So all these, like we've discussed before, all these mitzvahs become something that's are easy to keep when a person is in connection to their Creator. Now, why do we need the mitzvahs if a person could just be connected to God all the time? And the answer is because there's times when we lose that sense of connection, and we need to have firm rules that we know that we cannot transgress, even when we have a lapse of a sense of connection and we're feeling, person feels that things are not going their way, and maybe it would be good to steal here and there, and therefore they need to know this is forbidden, no matter how connected to your Creator you're feeling, or how conscious you are that you are God's creation. You need to have these rules, and these rules are not negotiable. So all these things a person is chayav for, that we just discussed, and this is included in the category of gazlan, even in situations where it might be a slightly different din in the case of Yisrael. So one of the other interesting things he brings over here, that a non-Jewish person is chayav even less than a shava pruta. So I found over here on a note on the side of my Rambam, it said, I wrote to myself, Ra kli yokar, parshas neyach, or gazel, pachas mashava pruta. So I didn't come to my head what that was. So I looked up the kli yokar tonight, and see over here a fascinating discussion in the kli yokar on Ish Tzadik Tomim Hai B'Deirosov in Parshas Neach in Vav Yud Aleph, and he says over here that when it says in this pasuk, the Tishachis Haaretz Nifnei HaElokim, the Elokim is referring to the judges, and that's interesting to understand that there were people that were supposed to be judging at that time, but people became very, very clever, and they decided that they could steal less than a Sheva Pruta, which is a Sheva Pruta is a certain amount of money, varies from time to time, but in the order of maybe a few pennies, 5 cents, let's say, and it's considered de minimis. If something's de minimis, then it doesn't. It's like no one's going to notice. It doesn't really matter, and it's not going to break anyone's bank account. So what started happening over here is that they would lifnei Elokim. It means that they were stealing right in front of the judges. That they would do it right in front of them. They weren't even worried about getting prosecuted or chayav because it was in their eyes as irrelevant and unable to do anything. So it's interesting over here that this is why that the whole earth became, because of this, this is why the earth became full of thievery. So I wrote over here in the margins, well, we have to understand to look into this deeper, because it says there's no shiurim, there's no by Gezel, number one in general, and second of all, the Rambam says over here, no, they're still liable even under a Sheva Pruta. So what happened that before the Mabul, they were so to speak playing with the judges and taunting them by stealing less than a Sheva Pruta, because the judges couldn't take any action, that therefore the whole world became one that was totally full of thievery. And I don't have an answer for it right now, and maybe someone else could bring up the answer. But one possibility is that when the Rambam was recording this, understanding what the Kli Yakar was saying, the concept of the complete destabilization of civilization. Once you say, this is really not significant. We're into big principles. We say you can't steal, but if it's really small, it doesn't really matter. So if you can justify in your mind, and there's no way back from that, that just leads to total chaos and a total disintegration of civilization. I'm just offering that as a suggestion to understand the difference between what the Kli Yakar is saying. It's not really a difference. He's saying that's the way it was then, but I think it's a fascinating concept that once you can rationalize this is only a small thing, then a person will do it, and then they'll do it even in front of the judges because, hey, no one can stop me. So that's itself a powerful lesson. What we have to recognize is that there's no thing that's too small. If you're taking the penny from the other guy when he's not looking, or even when he's looking, again, it's an indication that the person has disconnected themselves from their source. They're disconnected from this. They're taking has not been allocated to them. So it really comes down to principles of emunah. This is not raw laws that have no fabric to them, have no life to them. These are the lifeblood of all this connection with Hashem, is the emunah, the belief in God, and the belief that there's nothing besides God. So once that's totally implanted in them, that he's going to live that way, it's impossible to take anything from anyone else. So you have to teach these laws with that context and that concept. I mean to say, when you're sitting with non-Jewish people, you're sitting with non-Jewish children, and you're explaining to them, you're not just saying, don't take something that doesn't belong to you. Why should you take something that doesn't belong to you? Because God is giving you what you need and what you're meant to have right now, and he's giving the other guy what he needs. And when you think that you're going to take that other guy's thing, it's because you've lost track of who's really in charge over here. To understand that there's a God that's in charge of the entire world, and we believe and we teach the concept of hashgacha pratis, that every single thing in all of creation is done exactly at that moment the way it is, because God Almighty is causing it to happen in exactly that way. So we have to recognize that, and we have to recognize that what we have right now is because of this hashgacha pratis. This hashgacha pratis, I have this and he has that. And it's not for me to now take his in order to make up what I think I'm lacking. If I think I'm lacking something, there's a simple solution. And the solution is that a non-Jew is required to pray to God for his needs. So we are educating the world in a framework for life. Again, this is not, if you just try to teach this, okay, here's a checklist, don't steal, and then you walk away from the person, you have not transformed that person into Chassidei Umas Olam, because you haven't shared with him, why is a person motivated to steal? Why might you think to steal? What does that indicate as a problem? You're not living the belief in Hashem and God, and why you're not living that belief in Hashem? Because you think you don't have something you need. It's all a fundamental mentality of shortage. Same thing with the previous halachas we learned, that in terms of taking on relationships that are not permissible, it's for the same thing. A person thinks he doesn't have enough with what he has, so therefore he needs someone else's. That is absolutely, it's not just forbidden, it's totally misguided. It's not just an act of inclination that comes across a person to take something. It's the inclination only comes when a person's so disconnected from reality. So our job is to reconnect them to reality, to reconnect every human being to reality, so he will understand. When he starts having that feeling that he is missing something, he will remind himself, and through our teaching, he will be reminded that no, he has everything he needs, and don't go for that concept. Also, the same thing is to go back into the previous discussion about the forbidden relationships. It's very important to recognize that fundamentally, when a person has a thought of such a thing, it's because they feel they don't have enough love, they don't have enough of what they think they need. And we have to remind ourselves that we're not meant to take this type of love and affection in that way from another person. That is not meant to, that we're not allowed to be together with. The love and affection, we have to remind ourselves and ground ourselves, is really coming from Hashem himself. It's really coming from God Almighty. And if a person needs a hug, he can ask God for a hug. It's not to say that it's not important to have a man to have a hug from his wife, and a woman to not have a hug from her husband. But that's in a permissible relationship. When a person starts to feel that he needs more of that and he's not getting enough in the permissible relationship, it's a sign that he is, again, disconnected from the hug that God is giving him all the time. If a person was to recognize that God is hugging him and bound up with him and giving him life, and every single breath is a gift from God, then he's got everything he needs. And that's what we have to bring the humanity to recognize and feel and see. But all of humanity is going to see that this entire existence, not an intellectual concept. It doesn't say they will become to understand and be able to have a pilpul in this. They're saying, it says that all of humanity will come to see this. It will become self-evident and see in our own flesh what. Not only that we'll see, all flesh will see, but all flesh will see that what all flesh is really just Hashem. So once you see that, then you have everything you need. So then the Rambam continues over here in Halacha Yud. He continues and says that a non-Jew is also chayiv in a mitzvah called Eiver Min HaChai. He's not allowed to take the limb of a living animal. And one of the big issues over here is that the determination of when an animal is permissible to be eaten by a non-Jew, it has to completely cease moving. Merely slaughtering the animal in a way that what might be considered kosher, is that the two simanim are completely cut, is not sufficient for a non-Jew. The animal cannot be dismembered to be eaten until it completely stops moving. That is a very important point in modern meat processing in America, and this is constantly changing, but people need to be educated that the standard way of killing animals is in a way that could be considered Eiver Min HaChai, because the process by which the animal is shot and the machinery that's used, the animal is still moving, and its limbs are still moving, and then it's cut up while it's still moving. So that is considered Eiver Min HaChai. So there's a very serious question here about Eiver Min HaChai. That's one thing that I think is really important to emphasize. Sometimes people say, oh, Eiver Min HaChai, we don't see people ripping limbs off animals in America or in Europe, and therefore it's not an issue. This must be something that used to be done in primitive cultures. And the answer is have to learn the Rambam and understand that as long as it's still moving around, still its limbs are still moving, it's considered forbidden and it's considered Eiver Min HaChai. Then also Eiver Min HaChai, eating from a living animal is also in any amount. It says that it doesn't think that it's necessary. Death penalty is the consequence for eating from a limb of a living bird, but obviously it's not appropriate. And then we discussed already the particular halachas about the shtei samanim. Anything that's forbidden for a Jew from Eiver Min HaChai is also forbidden on a non-Jew. And then there's the different details that are even more obligated for B'nai Noach. But the general concept is here that what I said before is he's explaining that it has to be something that has to be completely ceased from any form of life in it whatsoever. Okay, then we're going to continue here, and we can wrap up this portion in talking about the Sheva mitzvahs, the law of dinim, what happens in the obligation to set up courts of law, and they are obligated to seat dayanim and judges and in every place. Okay, so this means in every community, every location requires courts of law to judge on the 6 mitzvahs that we just spoke about. And also they're obligated to warn the people as to what their obligations are and what they're not allowed to do. And if someone has, God forbid, has been over one of these Sheva mitzvahs, then he is executed by the sword. And this is, the Rambam says, this is why all the residents of Shechem were responsible, and not only responsible, but were executed by Yaakov's sons, by Shimon and Levi, because they saw, and they were aware that Shechem had gone ahead and stolen Dinah, and they knew about it, they saw it, they knew about it, and they didn't do anything about it. So therefore, since they were responsible to, and the 7th mitzvah, the 7th and Sheva mitzvahs, they were responsible to try and judge and execute if a punishment was warranted against Shechem, and they failed to do so, then they themselves were now in violation of the 7th law, which is to set up courts of law. And some interesting, important points over here, that the Ben Neach is executed with one witness, with one judge, with warning is not necessary, and it could be relatives, but not with the female witness and not with a female judge. So this is something that we have to realize, that we cannot take for granted the state of legal affairs in the United States or in Europe and other countries, because the requirement of the judges, while we do have a judicial system, we do have judges, we see that many of these laws are not being enforced. And not only that, but even in simple things that used to be unacceptable only 20, 30, 40 years ago in courts of law in the United States, are now becoming acceptable. And this is, I'll give you an example. So we've been fighting for a client, a doctor, and a client, a pharmacist, and a patient in the state of New Jersey, that against physician-assisted suicide. So one judge gave a temporary restraining order that was overturned by the appellate division, that was then upheld by the Supreme Court in New Jersey, sent back to the Superior Court, and then the original judge retired and a new judge took over, and he recently dismissed the entire case. So here's what we discussed before in the laws of murder. This is murder, literally murder, that a person is being given a poison by a doctor, and even though it's at his request, and the person may, according to the speculation, die, but the Rambam is saying that even if for sure he's going to die, it's still forbidden to participate in murdering this person. And the judge says, you don't have a case. So I would like to suggest that if you are under the illusion that the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach are being upheld, it's an illusion, because first of all, the murder is permissible by the legislature, and the court refuses to overturn the legislature. So there's no question that the Sheva Mitzvahs is not what's the ruling authority of law at this point in time. And this is something that is changing before our eyes, meaning to say 30 years ago, actually 40 years ago, the Supreme Court in New Jersey ruled in a case that they would not allow euthanasia, they would not allow physician-assisted suicide, the medicine cannot be used to kill people. This was something that they made very clear in their ruling. And yet only 40 years later, the court today completely ignores the ruling of the court from 40 years ago. It's mind-boggling that they talk about how the law is supposed to be based on respecting the prior decisions. They completely ignore it, and they say it doesn't apply, and so forth. And I would like to suggest that if you think that America doesn't need Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach because people are basically decent, which is true. Thank God we live in a country of decent people and good people. At the same time, the lack of education, the lack of a court system that's willing to stand up for what's right is an indication of how far afield the country and the court system has drifted from the absolute idea of right and wrong and the absolute idea of God's law. That is what we're meant to be teaching the world. So instead of bemoaning this fact and writing all kinds of blog posts about how the decay of morality and so forth, the answer is we don't have any time to sigh and bemoan. We need to now recognize that the only way to change the entire direction is not to try to get it back to where it was 40 years ago. Because my friends, where it was 40 years ago was already without any foundation, because it was based on their human logic at the time that they weren't going to allow this. But because it was based on human logic, now human logic has become far superior and far more advanced. And now it advocates and permits murder and refuses to even see that the people who are trying to stop it have a cause of action. Like, unbelievably, the judge said that my client, the doctor, doesn't have, and none of the clients, none of the plaintiffs have any standing. They don't have a right to come to court to prevent the murder of other people. So that is the level of where things have gone, but they've gone to that level because 40 years ago was already on a weak foundation. It had no foundation. Meaning to say, when we read the opinion from 40 years ago, we would have said, "Oh, you see, it's good," because it was based on human logic and not on an absolute divine wisdom that's recorded in our Torah and the swarm of that explain the Torah. Because of that, it was already without any real foundation at that point in time. We're just now seeing it in reality, how bad off it is. So the answer is that we cannot hearken back and yearn for the days of old that 40 years ago, wow, we should need judges like that. No, the judges like that wrote the decision that allowed itself to be ignored 40 years later, because they based it on a reasoning that someone else has a smarter reasoning now. So the answer is we have to have a new vision for what a world founded and organized and thriving based on God's law is going to look like. And when we are communicating that to people, we're not asking to go back to make things the way they were. We're trying to catapult the world ahead to a place where it's meant to be, and it's been meant to be all these thousands of years, to a place where it will be built in tzedek v'yesher, on what's just and what's straight. That is what our job is. So that's very important to keep that in mind. We are trying to get humanity to jump over any type of inconveniences and unpleasantnesses that come from an uncivilized world. Like we said that, and Yonason Steif said that Ein Ben David Ba'at Shekola Malchius Yihapech B'Minus, that he's saying that all the nations will come to deny God, the governments will come to deny God, and that will lead to a collapse of civilization. And then the non-Jews will come to the Yidden and say, show us what the Torah says, because everything else has failed us. Well, that is Mashiach. But we don't want to go through all that collapse of civilization, because it's very painful and it's a tremendous upheaval. We want to jump straight to the end result over here. Let's just go straight to the people and talk to them right now. This is how we're meant to live our lives. It's a beautiful life. God has given us everything we need. This is something that's going to allow us to thrive as a human, as humanity, and take us out of all the spiritual and physical ailments that are confronting humanity, and take us directly, every human being, into a direct relationship with his creator, where he's no longer dependent on a human being to make decisions for him. He's no longer dependent on a human being to provide his food for him, and to try to rule over him. But every human being is going to be directly connected to God Almighty. Now we can open up for questions. If people have questions, I'm happy to, you could put them in the chat messages, and we could just have any questions.